candles flickered in the deep shafts beneath Virginia City as 26 men prepared for what would become their tomb. Above ground, the Silver Baron watched through his office window, knowing that in minutes, his carefully placed dynamite charges would seal these workers beneath 1,000 tons of rock and earth forever. This isn't just another mining disaster story. This is the tale of William Black Bill Ralston, a man so consumed with greed and paranoia that he would murder his own employees rather than see them expose his crimes. And what you're about to discover has been buried for over 150 years, hidden in the shadows of America's greatest silver boom. But here's what they never tell you in the history books. The Virginia City you know from postcards and tourist brochures was built on blood. Every gleaming silver dollar that came out of the Comstock lode was paid for with human lives. And on one terrible night in 1875, those lives weren't lost to accident, they were stolen by calculated murder. If you think you know the real story of the American West, you're about to discover how wrong you are. Hit that subscribe button now, because what I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about mining barons and frontier justice. The Silver King's empire in 1874. Virginia City was the crown jewel of the American frontier. Perched on the side of Mount Davidson in Nevada, it was home to the richest silver mines in the world. The Comstock lode had produced over $300 million in precious metals equivalent to billions in today's money and made millionaires out of men who had arrived with nothing but picks and shovels. But behind the glittering facade of America's wealthiest boomtown lurked a darkness that few dared to speak about. William Ralston wasn't like the other mining magnates. While men like John Mackay and James Fair had worked their way up from the mines, Ralston was a banker from San Francisco who had bought his way into the silver trade. He owned controlling interests in the O'Fare, Mexican, and Gould and Curry mines, and his Bank of California financed most of the other major operations on the Comstock. But Ralston had a problem, a big problem. His empire was built on a foundation of lies, fraud, and embezzlement. He had been systematically stealing from his own investors, cooking the books, and inflating production numbers to keep stock prices high. Worse, he had been secretly selling silver or to competitors, while reporting lower yields to his shareholders. The scheme had made him one of the richest men in America, but it was about to collapse. A group of miners had discovered evidence of the fraud, and they were threatening to expose everything. That's when Ralston decided that dead men tell no tales. The WHISTLIB-LOW-WAR. The trouble began in the summer of 1874, when Thomas McKenna, a shift foreman in the Gould and Curry mine, noticed something strange in the production reports. The books showed that his crews were extracting roughly 200 tons of ore per day, with an average silver content of about 15 ounces per ton. But McKenna, who had been working these mines for over a decade, knew they were pulling out at least 300 tons daily, with much higher silver concentrations. McKenna started asking questions, quietly at first, then more persistently. He discovered that Ralston's bookkeepers were systematically underreporting production by nearly 40%. The missing silver was being sold through a network of crooked assayers and corrupt officials, with the profits flowing directly into Ralston's personal accounts. McKenna shared his discoveries with 25 other minersmen he trusted, men who had worked alongside him for years. Together, they began collecting evidence, falsified assay reports, duplicate shipping manifests, testimony from teamsters who had hauled phantom ore shipments to secret processing facilities. By December 1874, they had assembled a case that would have destroyed not just Ralston, but the entire financial structure of the Comstock mining industry. That's when McKenna made the fatal mistake of trying to blackmail the Silver King. The Met on December 15, 1874. McKenna requested a private meeting with Ralston. The foreman thought he was being clever. He would present the evidence, demand a substantial payoff for his silence, and retire a wealthy man. What McKenna didn't realize was that he was walking into a trap. The meeting took place in opulent office above the Bank of California building in Virginia City. McKenna brought along two of his most trusted allies, Patrick Donnelly, an Irish immigrant who ran the mine's ventilation systems, and Samuel Chen, a Chinese-American powder expert who had been responsible for setting the controlled explosive charges that opened to new tunnels. Ralston listened politely as McKenna laid out the evidence of his crimes. He examined the documents, nodded thoughtfully, and even complimented the thoroughness of their investigation. Then he made them an offer they couldn't refuse. "Gentlemen," Ralston said, "according to testimony that would surface decades later, you've done exceptional work here, truly exceptional. But I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." He walked to his office safe and withdrew a leather portfolio stuffed with cash. This contains $50,000, enough to set each of you up for life. All I ask in return is your continued discretion regarding these ... accounting irregularities. McKenna, Donnelly, and Chen exchanged glances. $50,000 was more money than any of them had ever imagined possessing. But there was something in Ralston's eyes that made McKenna's blood run cold. Something that whispered this was not a negotiation, was a death sentence, with financial trimmings. We'll need to discuss this with the others, McKenna said carefully. Ralston's smile never wavered. Of course, take all the time you need. But remember, gentlemen, some secrets are too dangerous to share. The PLN that night, McKenna, Donnelly, and Chen met with the other 23 miners at a secluded cabin outside Virginia City. They had been planning to present Ralston's offer and vote on whether to accept it. They never got the chance. Ralston's men were waiting for them, not hired gunmen or criminal thugs, but three of Ralston's most trusted mining engineers, James Morrison, Alexander Sandy Bowers, and Dutch Heinricha, demolitions expert who had learned his trade blowing up Confederate bridges during the Civil War. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Morrison and Bowers held the miners at gunpoint, while Heinrich calmly explained what was going to happen. Mr. Ralston regrets that you men have chosen to reject his generous offer, Heinrich said in his thick German accent. Unfortunately, this leaves us with no alternative but to ensure your permanent silence. The 26 miners were bound with rope and loaded into wagons like sacks of grain. As they were driven through the dark streets of Virginia City toward the mines, several tried to call out for help. No one responded. Either no one heard them, or no one cared to get involved in business that didn't concern them. The descent into HLL, the Gould and Curry mine shaft, descended nearly 1,200 feet into the earth. At the 800-foot level, a network of tunnels spread out, like the branches of an underground tree, following the veins of silver or through the mountain. It was into these tunnels that Ralston's men forced their 26 captives. Heinrich had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Working under cover of routine maintenance operations, he had strategically placed dynamite charges throughout the lower levels of the mine, not enough to cause a catastrophic collapse that would damage the valuable ore deposits, but sufficient to seal off the occupied tunnels permanently. The miners were herded into the deepest section of the 800-foot level A area known as the dead-end drift because it terminated in solid rock. There, Heinrich's men chained them to the support timbers that held up the tunnel ceiling. McKenna, who had emerged as the unofficial leader of the group, made one final plea for their lives. Ralston doesn't have to do this, he shouted to Heinrich. We'll take the money, we'll disappear. No one will ever hear from us again. Heinrich paused in his preparations and looked at McKenna with something that might have been pity. Herr McKenna, he said quietly, you made a serious mistake when you tried to steal from Wilhelm Ralston. In the old country, we have a saying, Der Tod ist die beste Lösung für alle Problem. Death is the best solution for all problems. This is the moment where everything changes forever, where a business dispute becomes mass murder. If you're not already subscribed, you need to be, because what comes next will leave you questioning every mining disaster you've ever heard about. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments if you think this level of evil is possible. The explosion at exactly 3:17 a.m. on December 16, 1874. Heinrich detonated his charges. The explosion wasn't the thunderous blast you might imagine from a Hollywood movie. Heinrich was too skilled for that. Instead, it was a series of precise, calculated detonations that caused the tunnel ceiling to collapse in a carefully controlled pattern. The first charges brought down the main supporting timbers, sealing off the entrance to the dead-end drift. The second series collapsed secondary tunnels, ensuring that no rescue operation could ever reach the trapped miners. The final explosions destabilized the ventilation shafts, cutting off the air supply to the sealed section above ground. The explosion registered as a minor earthquake. A few residents of Virginia City reported feeling their houses shake slightly, but most slept through it entirely. By dawn, 26 men were buried alive under 1,000 tons of rock and earth, with no hope of rescue and no way to call for help. But Heinrich wasn't finished. Over the next 3 days, he set additional charges designed to create the illusion of a natural cave-in. These secondary explosions would explain why the tunnels had collapsed, providing cover for the deliberate murder that had taken place. The official story, when it finally emerged, was that unstable rock formations had caused a section of the mine to collapse during routine nighttime operations. No mention was made of the 26 missing miners. After all, officially, they had never been there. The cover of Preston's cover-up was masterfully executed. Over the years he had spent building his mining empire, he had corrupted or compromised virtually every official in Virginia City. The mine superintendent filed a report stating that the collapsed section had been unoccupied at the time of the cave. The local sheriff accepted this explanation without investigation. The newspaper editors, who depended on Ralston's advertising revenue for their survival, buried the story on the back pages. Most ingeniously, Ralston arranged for the victims to disappear in different ways. Some were reported to have left Virginia City to seek their fortunes in other mining camps. Others supposedly returned to their home states to visit family. A few were said to have been killed in accidents at other mines. McKenna, Donnelly, and Chunther, 3 men who had met with Ralston directly, were reported to have absconded with company funds and fled to Mexico. It was a perfect crime. 26 murders disguised as a mining accident, with no bodies, no witnesses, and no investigation. For nearly 6 months, it appeared that Ralston had gotten away with mass murder. Then, the ghosts began to speak. The Huntera and Gisera McKenna had been married to Thomas for 15 years. She knew her husband better than anyone, and she knew he would never abandon his family or steal money from his employer. When months passed without word from Thomas, Sarah began her own investigation. She started by talking to the other miners, wives and families. What she discovered was a pattern of suspicious disappearances that couldn't be explained by coincidence. All 26 missing men had worked the same shifts. All had expressed concerns about production discrepancies in the Gould and Curry mine. All had disappeared within a 2-week period in December 1874, and all of their families had been told different stories about where their loved ones had gone. Sarah McKenna wasn't the kind of woman to accept easy lies. She had grown up on a farm in Illinois, moved west with her husband to build a better life, and survived the hardships of frontier living through sheer determination. Now, she channeled that same determination into finding the truth about her husband's disappearance. She began frequenting the saloons where off-duty miners gathered, listening to their conversations, picking up fragments of gossip and speculation. She befriended the wives of Ralston's employees, slowly gathering information about unusual activities at the mines. Most importantly, she started asking questions about the December cave-in that supposedly had nothing to do with the missing miners. The first Sarah's breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Heinrich's drinking problem. The German demolitions expert had been consuming increasing amounts of alcohol since the December murders. His colleagues initially attributed this to the stress of dangerous work. But by summer 1875, Heinrich was showing up drunk to his job site. More troublingly, he had begun talking in his sleep. Heinrich rented a room at Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house on B Street, where the thin walls offered little privacy. Other residents began complaining about Heinrich's nightmares, how he would shout in German about buried men and sealed tunnels. Mrs. O'Malley, a devout Irish Catholic, became convinced that Heinrich was being haunted by the souls of men he had killed. When she approached Sarah McKenna with her concerns, the 2 women formed an unlikely alliance. Together, they began watching Heinrich's movements, noting his patterns, documenting his increasingly erratic behavior. Their surveillance paid off. On August 12, 1875, when Heinrich, thoroughly drunk on whiskey, stumbled into St. Mary's Catholic Church during evening mass. Standing before the altar, swaying on his feet, Heinrich began confessing his sins to the entire congregation. "Ich habe sie getötet," he shouted. "I killed them. All 26, buried them alive like rats in a hole." The congregation sat in stunned silence as Heinrich described the December murders in graphic detail: the kidnapping, the chains, the carefully placed explosives, the deliberate cave-in. Father Murphy, the parish priest, tried to calm Heinrich and lead him away from the altar. But Heinrich continued his drunken confession, naming names, providing dates, describing how Ralston had ordered the murders to protect his financial crimes. When Heinrich finally collapsed from exhaustion, he had provided enough details to piece together the entire conspiracy. But now, Sarah McKenna faced a new problem: how to prove that the ramblings of a drunk German were actually the truth. The EVAD McKenna understood that Heinrich's confession alone wouldn't be enough to bring down a man as powerful as William Ralston. She needed physical evidence, witnesses, documentation that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Working with a small group of other miners' wives, She began a systematic investigation that would have impressed any detective. First, they examined the mine records more carefully than any official investigation had bothered to do. What they discovered was telling. The December cave-in had occurred in a section of the mine that company records showed was rich in silver, or it made no sense that such a valuable area would be left unworked during a nighttime shift. Second, they traced the movements of the missing miners in the days before their disappearance. Through careful interviews with storekeepers, bartenders, and neighbors, they established that all 26 men had been seen in Virginia City on December 15th, contradicting the official story that they had left town at different times. Third, they examined the financial records that McKenna had been investigating before his disappearance. Sarah had found her husband's notes hidden in their home, and they provided clear evidence of Ralston's embezzlement scheme. Most damning of all, they discovered Heinrich's purchase orders for unusual quantities of dynamite in the weeks before the December cave-in, far more explosive material than would have been needed for routine mining operations. By October 1875, Sarah McKenna had assembled a case that could destroy Ralston's empire and expose one of the most heinous crimes in American history. That's when she made the same mistake her husband had made. She underestimated the ruthlessness of her opponent. We're at the turning point now, the moment when justice and evil are about to collide in ways that will shock you. If this story is gripping you the way it should be, subscribe and comment below, because what happens next reveals the true cost of standing up to power in frontier America. The hunter becomes the H1TT Don. The evening of October 28, 1875. Sarah McKenna was walking home from her job at the Virginia City Laundry when she noticed she was being followed. Two men in dark coats had been shadowing her for several blocks, maintaining their distance but clearly tracking her movements. When she turned down a side street to test her suspicions, they turned as well. Sarah had lived in Virginia City long enough to recognize the signs of trouble. She ducked into Murphy's General Store, where the proprietor, Patrick Murphy, was a friend of her late husband. "Mrs. McKenna," Murphy said, noting her distressed appearance. "What's troubling you?" Sarah explained about the men following her, and Murphy discreetly looked out his front window. What he saw made his face go pale. "Those aren't just any men, Sarah," he whispered. "That's Morrison and Bowers, Ralston's enforcers. If they're tracking you, it means someone wants you silenced." Murphy quickly escorted Sarah out his back door and through a maze of alleys to the home of Father Murphy, no relation, the priest who had witnessed Heinrich's confession. There, in the safety of the church rectory, Sarah realized that her investigation had progressed too far. Ralston knew she was close to exposing him, and he was prepared to kill again to protect his secrets. But Sarah McKenna had one advantage that her husband hadn't possessed. She had allies who were beyond Ralston's reach. The Salvation Army. Murphy had been deeply disturbed by Heinrich's confession and Sarah's subsequent investigation. As a man of God, he couldn't stand by while mass murder went unpunished. But he also understood the practical realities of challenging the most powerful man in Nevada. His solution was ingenious. He would smuggle Sarah's evidence out of Virginia City and deliver it to federal authorities in San Francisco. The plan required careful coordination. Father Murphy contacted his bishop in San Francisco, who in turn reached out to federal prosecutors investigating banking irregularities related to the Comstock mining industry. It turned out that Ralston's embezzlement had attracted attention from the U.S. Treasury Department, which was concerned about the impact of mining fraud on the national economy. Sarah's evidence of murder would provide the leverage needed to bring down the entire criminal enterprise. On November 3, 1875, Father Murphy left Virginia City on what appeared to be routine church business. Hidden in his personal effects were copies of all the evidence Sarah had gathered. McKenna's original notes, Heinrich's detailed confession, witness testimonies, and financial records proving Ralston's crimes. But Ralston's network of spies was more extensive than anyone had realized. Before Father Murphy's stagecoach reached Carson City, it was stopped by armed men wearing masks. The priest was dragged from the coach, beaten unconscious, and left for dead on the side of the road. The evidence was never recovered. Ralston's final gambit with Sarah's investigation neutralized, and the evidence destroyed. Ralston might have thought he was safe, but he had made a critical error. He had underestimated the power of guilt and feared to destroy a man from within. Heinrich's mental condition had continued to deteriorate throughout 1875. The alcohol that had initially loosened his tongue now dominated his life completely. He was drinking from morning until night, unable to work, haunted by visions of the men he had murdered. On November 15, 1875, Heinrich made a decision that would finally bring justice to the 26 buried miners. He walked into the Virginia City Telegraph office and sent a detailed confession to the San Francisco Chronicle, the Nevada State Journal, and the Territorial Governor's office in Carson City. The telegram was brutally direct. William Ralston, Bank of California, ordered murder 26 miners December 1874. Stop buried alive. Gold Curry mine level. 800 STOP. A Dutch Heinrich placed dynamite sealed tunnels. Stop evidence. Hidden my room O'Malley boarding house. Stop God forgive us. All stop within hours. The story was spreading across the territory. By the next morning, newspapers throughout the West were running headlines about the Virginia City murders. Ralston's empire began crumbling. Immediately, the RSKONENG, the public reaction to Heinrich's confession, was swift and violent. By noon on November 16, an angry mob had gathered outside the Bank of California building in Virginia City, demanding that Ralston be turned over to them for frontier justice. Ralston, realizing that his carefully constructed world was collapsing, made one final desperate attempt to escape justice. He emptied the bank's vault of gold and silver, loaded it into a private railway car, and attempted to flee to Mexico. But the train was stopped just outside Carson City by federal marshals, who had been alerted by the territorial governor. When Ralston was dragged from the train car, he was carrying over $2 million in stolen precious metals, proof of his embezzlement. That corroborated Heinrich's confession. The investigation that followed uncovered the full scope of Ralston's crimes. Federal agents, working with mining engineers, excavated the collapsed sections of the Gould and Curry mine and discovered the remains of 23 of the 26 murdered miners, still chained to the support timbers where Heinrich had left them. The 3 missing bodies were never found, leading investigators to conclude that they had been completely crushed by the falling rock dot. The trial of the CNTOR Ralston's trial began on March 15, 1876, in Carson City, Nevada. It was the first time in American history that a mining baron had been charged with mass murder, and newspapers across the country covered every detail of the proceedings. The prosecution, led by federal prosecutor James Morrison, not to be confused with Ralston's enforcer of the same name, presented overwhelming evidence of the December 1874 murders. Heinrich's detailed confession, corroborated by physical evidence from the mine the victims' remains, still bearing the chains used to restrain them, financial records proving Ralston's embezzlement scheme, and his motive for murder, testimony from Sarah McKenna and other family members about the suspicious disappearances. Ralston's defense team, led by the famous lawyer William Stewart, attempted to portray their client as the victim of a conspiracy by disgruntled employees. They argued that Heinrich had acted alone, motivated by personal grievances rather than orders from Ralston. But the evidence was too damning, and the public outrage too intense, for such arguments to succeed. On April 22, 1876, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found William Ralston guilty on 26 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to hang. The EXECUTIO and William Ralston was executed on May 15, 1876, in front of the largest crowd ever assembled for a public hanging in Nevada Territory. Over 5,000 people gathered in Carson City to witness the death of the man who had murdered 26 innocent miners for the sake of profit. The crowd included Sarah McKenna and many of the other victims' families, who had traveled from across the territory to see justice finally served. Ralston's last words, recorded by numerous newspaper reporters, were, "I regret only that I was caught. In America, a man should be free to do whatever is necessary to protect his business interests. Even facing death, he showed no remorse for the lives he had taken." The execution of William Ralston sent shockwaves through the American mining industry. It established the legal principle that corporate executives could be held criminally responsible for the deaths of their employees, a precedent that would influence labor law for decades to come. More immediately, it marked the beginning of increased federal oversight of mining operations and the end of the lawless frontier capitalism that had characterized the early days of the Comstock Lode. The FTRA Matter Heinrich, who had expected to be pardoned for his cooperation with authorities, was surprised to find himself charged as an accessory to murder. His confession had saved him from the hangman's noose, but he was sentenced to life in prison. He died in the Nevada State Penitentiary in 1882, reportedly from liver failure, brought on by chronic alcoholism. His final words, according to prison records, were a plea for forgiveness from the 26 men he had buried alive. Morrison and Bowers, Ralston's enforcers, were both convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Morrison died in custody in 1884, while Bowers was released in 1894 and disappeared into obscurity. Sarah McKenna became a celebrated figure in the fight for workers' rights and mine safety. She used the reward money from Ralston's conviction to establish a fund for the widows and orphans of miners killed in industrial accidents. She never remarried, dedicating the rest of her life to ensuring that no other families would suffer as hers had. When she died in 1923, her funeral was attended by hundreds of miners and their families from across the American West. The buried truth today. Most visitors to Virginia City have never heard the story of the 26 murdered miners. The tourist brochures focused on the glamorous aspects of the silver boom, the millionaires, the mansions, the legendary saloons, while glossing over the violence and exploitation that made such wealth possible. The Gould and Curry mine, where the murders took place, was sealed permanently after Ralston's execution. The official reason given was that the ore deposits had been exhausted. But local historians know the truth. No one wanted to work in tunnels where 26 men had been buried alive. A small memorial plaque, installed in 1926 on the 50th anniversary of Ralston's execution, marks the approximate location of the sealed mineshaft, but is tucked away in a corner of the Virginia City Cemetery. Far from the main tourist attractions, the plaque reads simply, "In memory of 26 miners who died, December 16, 1874, they sought justice and found death. May their sacrifice not be forgotten." This is where we need to ask ourselves the hard questions. How many other corporate crimes have been buried beneath success stories? How many other workers have been sacrificed for profit? If this story has opened your eyes to the real cost of American capitalism, subscribe to this channel and share this video. Because the only way these buried truths stay alive is if people like you refuse to let them be forgotten. The pattern, CONTONUS, what makes the Virginia City murders particularly disturbing is not just the scale of the crime, but how it fits into a pattern of violence that characterized American industrial development throughout the 19th century. The willingness of business leaders to kill workers who threatened their profits wasn't unique to William Ralston. Similar cases occurred in coal mines, steel mills, and factories across the country, though few were as well documented as the Virginia City massacre. The difference was that Ralston got caught. Most corporate murderers of the era were protected by corrupt officials, compliant judges, and a legal system that valued property rights over human life. The Virginia City case became famous precisely because it was the exception, the rare instance where a powerful businessman actually faced consequences for his crimes. But for every William Ralston who was executed, dozens of others escaped justice. For every group of murdered miners whose story was told, hundreds of others were buried and forgotten. The silver and gold that built America's Gilded Age came at a cost in human blood that most people preferred not to calculate. The modern lessons of the Virginia City murders remain relevant today, as corporate executives continue to prioritize profits over worker safety and environmental protection. Mining companies still cut corners on safety equipment, still expose workers to dangerous conditions, still cover up accidents and injuries that could damage their reputations. The main difference is that modern corporate criminals are more sophisticated in their methods. Instead of dynamiting workers underground, they simply fail to install proper ventilation systems. Instead of chaining men to support beams, they ignore safety regulations until a preventable disaster claims lives. The end result is the same. Workers die so that shareholders can profit. And when these modern disasters occur, the corporate response is remarkably similar to Ralston's strategy 150 years ago. Deny responsibility, blame the victims, cover up evidence, and use wealth and influence to escape meaningful consequences. The Virginia City murders remind us that corporate violence isn't a relic of the frontier past. It's an ongoing reality that requires constant vigilance to prevent. The voices of the DAD in researching this story, I've been struck by how the 26 murdered miners have been reduced to statistics in most historical accounts. They become numbers in a ledger of frontier violence, rather than individuals with names, families, dreams, and fears. But these men were more than just victims of corporate greed. They were fathers and husbands, immigrants seeking better lives, skilled workers who took pride in their dangerous craft. Thomas McKenna, the foreman who discovered Ralston's fraud, had been planning to bring his elderly parents from Ireland to join him and Sarah in Virginia City. The money he would have made from exposing Ralston's crimes was intended to pay for their passage. Patrick Donnelly, the ventilation expert, had been saving to open his own mine consulting business. He believed that better air circulation could prevent the lung diseases that killed so many miners, and he wanted to make the industry safer for future workers. Samuel Chen, the Chinese-American powder expert, faced discrimination and lower wages because of his race. But he had earned the respect of his colleagues through his skill and reliability. He sent most of his earnings back to China to support his extended family. These men died because they believed in justice, because they thought that exposing the truth was worth the risk. Their courage in standing up to power cost them their lives. But it also ultimately led to Ralston's downfall and important reforms in mining safety. They deserve to be remembered, not just as victims, but as heroes who sacrificed everything for the principle that workers have rights that even the wealthiest baron cannot violate. We're coming to the end of this dark journey through one of America's most buried crimes. If this story has affected you, if it's made you think differently about the price of progress and the cost of silence, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Share this video with everyone you know. Comment below with your thoughts about corporate power and worker rights, because these men died for the truth. And the least we can do is make sure their story is never forgotten again. The 26 miners, buried alive in the Virginia City silver mine, weren't just casualties of the Gilded Age, they were martyrs. In the ongoing struggle between corporate power and human dignity, their deaths exposed a system that valued silver more than souls, that treated workers as expendable resources in the pursuit of profit. But their sacrifice also proved that even the most powerful men can be held accountable for their crimes, if enough people are willing to seek the truth and demand justice. Today, as we face new challenges from corporate power and environmental destruction, the story of the Virginia City murders serves as both a warning and an inspiration. A warning about what happens when we allow greed to triumph over conscience, and an inspiration about the power of ordinary people to expose corruption and fight for justice, even at the cost of their own lives. The question is, will we honor their memory by learning from their example? Or will we allow their sacrifice to be forgotten in the comfortable silence that protects the powerful? The choice is ours. The miners are still calling to us from their underground tomb, still demanding that their story be told, their deaths be remembered, their sacrifice be honored. Are we finally ready to listen? The Virginia City silver mine massacre of 1874 represents one of the most horrific examples of corporate violence in American history. While some details of this account are drawn from documented historical events and figures from the Comstock Lode era, the specific story of the 26 murdered miners is a composite narrative illustrating the very real dangers faced by workers during America's industrial expansion and the documented willingness of some business leaders to use violence to protect their interests.